In the early hours of April 13, 1945, a secure teletype message arrived at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The message was short, but its impact on Adolf Hitler was profound. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died the day before. For Hitler, who had been following the progress of the war with obsessive intensity, this sudden death seemed, at first, like an extraordinary stroke of fortune. He immediately summoned his aides and called for champagne, convinced that the political landscape had shifted in Germany's favor overnight. In his mind, the United States might now reconsider its approach, and Germany could find an unexpected path to negotiation and survival. Hitler's reaction was not only a reflection of hope, but also of deep delusion. He saw parallels between Roosevelt's death and a historical event he admired, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg in 1762. Frederick the Great of Prussia had been saved from imminent defeat by an unforeseen political turn, and Hitler believed that history might be repeating itself. In his mind, just as Frederick had been spared by fortune, Germany too could escape its dire situation through a sudden political miracle. The comparison, however, was fundamentally flawed. Frederick had fought wars that were dynastic, limited in scope, and surrounded by negotiable alliances. His armies remained disciplined and capable of coordinated resistance. Hitler, in contrast, faced a shattered Wehrmacht, collapsing infrastructure, and multiple enemies advancing relentlessly. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin, while Western allies pushed deep into German territory. No sudden death in Washington could reverse this reality. Yet Hitler allowed himself to indulge in the fantasy. He spoke at length to his inner circle, describing the possibilities that Roosevelt's death might bring. He imagined secret sympathies within the political system, convinced that the new president, Harry S. Truman, would be more pliable or even willing to halt the destruction of Germany. His advisors listened with a mix of disbelief and concern, knowing that Germany's military position was beyond repair, yet Hitler's mind clung to the hope that political miracles could substitute for failing armies and depleted resources. For hours, he drew elaborate connections between Roosevelt's death and potential fractures in the Allied coalition. He envisioned a moment when diplomacy, rather than bombs and bullets, could determine the outcome of the war. This reflection revealed the depth of Hitler's psychological detachment from reality. He had long relied on improbable events to offset Germany's military shortcomings, and now, in the closing weeks of the war, this pattern intensified. Even in private, Hitler likened himself to Frederick the Great, imagining that he too might be spared by forces beyond his control. But the situation was nothing like the limited dynastic conflicts of the 18th century. His enemies were unified in their determination to achieve total victory, motivated not by negotiable political interests, but by knowledge of the atrocities committed under his regime. The idea that Roosevelt's death could suddenly reverse Germany's fortunes was not just unlikely, it was impossible. As the day progressed, Hitler's euphoria remained visible. Champagne flowed, and he spoke animatedly about the miracle he believed had arrived. Yet beneath this excitement, the cracks in his reasoning were growing. Germany's armies were fragmented and demoralized, the capital was under threat, and the resources needed to sustain any meaningful resistance were exhausted. The fantasy of political salvation clung to life in Hitler's mind, even as reality pressed in from every direction. By the end of the day, the first signs of disappointment began to emerge. The new president, Harry S. Truman, would not abandon the policies of unconditional surrender that Roosevelt had championed. The hope that the sudden death of one man could alter the trajectory of a global war was just that, a hope, fragile and illusory. Hitler's reliance on political miracles over military reality, his obsession with historical parallels, and his detachment from the dire circumstances surrounding him were all setting the stage for the harsh confrontation with reality that was soon to come. Hitler's initial euphoria after learning of Roosevelt's death quickly collided with the hard realities of the war. He had allowed himself to imagine that the change in American leadership might fracture the Allied coalition, that Truman could be more pliable, or that the United States would now seek a negotiated peace favorable to Germany. For days he clung to these fantasies, drawing elaborate scenarios in his mind, each more improbable than the last. Yet as April 1945 progressed, it became painfully clear that his understanding of the Allies was dangerously flawed. The Allied powers were not a fragile coalition awaiting a miracle to divide them. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union were bound by years of shared experience, knowledge of Nazi atrocities, and a determined commitment to total victory. Their goal was unconditional surrender, and they had demonstrated over and over that they would not compromise. Hitler, however, interpreted every minor event as confirmation of his hope. He believed that strategic mistakes or disagreements among the Allies could create openings for Germany to exploit. He ignored the reality that the coalition had survived disagreements before and would continue to do so, united by a moral and military purpose far stronger than he imagined. Hitler's misreading of the Allies was compounded by his detachment from the crumbling German military. The Wehrmacht, once disciplined and effective, had become fragmented, demoralized, and incapable of mounting any coherent resistance. Cities were destroyed, supply lines were severed, and communication was inconsistent. Soviet forces were pressing into the suburbs of Berlin, and Western Allied armies were cutting through central Germany with remarkable speed. Despite this, Hitler remained fixated on the idea that diplomacy and politics could overturn these catastrophic conditions. He compared the situation to historical events he admired, particularly Frederick the Great's narrow escape in 1762, and continued to see himself as a figure who might be spared by fortune. Yet these comparisons ignored the scale and nature of the conflict he faced. Frederick had navigated wars with limited objectives and negotiable enemies, often relying on disciplined armies to recover from setbacks. Hitler faced enemies who were ideologically committed, morally outraged, and strategically relentless. No miracle could substitute for the shattered reality of his forces and the overwhelming strength of the Allies. In private conversations and long monologues to his staff, Hitler speculated on potential cracks within the coalition. He imagined that political leaders in London or Washington might hesitate, that Truman might reconsider, or that some undisclosed sympathy for Germany could emerge. His aides, many of whom were exhausted, scared, or skeptical, listened as he mapped out possibilities that defied all evidence. His reasoning had become divorced from reality. He was living in a world defined by improbable political events rather than military facts. At the same time, Hitler's obsession with controlling the narrative in his own mind led him to dismiss reports of the Allied advance. When messengers brought updates of Soviet artillery positions or reports of Western Allied crossings into German territory, he often downplayed their significance, interpreting them through the lens of hope rather than fact. The contrast between what was actually happening on the ground and what Hitler believed was growing more pronounced by the hour. By mid-April, it was clear that the fantasy of Allied fracture could not withstand the evidence of military reality. Yet Hitler refused to abandon it completely. The psychological need for a miracle was stronger than any acknowledgement of defeat. This detachment not only misled his decisions, but also influenced his inner circle, many of whom remained paralyzed by loyalty, fear, or a shared hope that events might still bend in Germany's favor. In these days, the danger of overconfidence fueled by delusion became apparent. Hitler's misreading of the Allies, combined with the disintegration of the Wehrmacht, created a dangerous mix of denial and inaction. He imagined that political cunning could replace military power, that a sudden turn of events might still save the Reich. But history, relentless and unyielding, was preparing to confront him with the truth that no political miracle could counteract the total collapse of Germany's forces and the unified determination of the Allied powers. As Hitler's initial euphoria faded, he began to cling to another fantasy, the hope that Roosevelt's death could open the door to a negotiated peace. In his mind, America might now be more willing to listen, more flexible, and even open to halting the relentless destruction of German cities and forces. He imagined a scenario in which his generals and diplomats could extract terms that might preserve the Reich, or at least secure some measure of survival for its leadership. For Hitler, negotiation had become a lifeline, the one chance to reverse the collapse of everything he had built. But this hope was not grounded in reality. The nature of the war Hitler had waged made compromise impossible. Unlike Frederick the Great, who fought limited dynastic wars with negotiable objectives, Hitler had launched a war of racial annihilation across Europe. His enemies were no longer merely political rivals, they were morally determined to defeat him, informed by the horrors of concentration camps, mass executions, and terror campaigns. There was no room for half measures, no possibility of political concessions, saving Germany from total defeat. The Allies had committed themselves to unconditional surrender precisely because they understood the threat posed by the Nazi regime. Despite this, Hitler pored over maps, directives, and reports, searching for opportunities that simply did not exist. He instructed his staff to draft proposals that might appeal to the Americans, imagining that Truman would recognize the logic of sparing Germany from further destruction. He believed that the death of one man, Roosevelt, could suddenly reshape decades of diplomacy, forging cracks in alliances that had proven unbreakable. His advisors, many of whom had once been experienced military officers, struggled to conceal their disbelief. They saw the impossibility of the task, yet Hitler's obsession was relentless, and no argument could sway him from the vision of a miraculous peace. The contrast between historical analogy and present reality became even clearer. Frederick the Great's wars had involved armies capable of coordinated resistance and negotiable adversaries. Hitler faced a Wehrmacht in disarray, with units isolated, supplies cut off, and morale collapsing. Soviet forces were pressing into the suburbs of Berlin, and the Western Allies were sweeping through the heart of Germany with overwhelming force. No diplomatic overture, no political maneuver could compensate for the catastrophic state of his military, yet Hitler continued to insist that a miracle might change the outcome. This period also revealed Hitler's increasing reliance on fantasy over facts. Reports of collapsing defenses, shortages of ammunition, and retreating units were dismissed or reinterpreted as temporary setbacks. He believed that the war was still salvageable if only the right political opportunity could be found. Each day he retreated further into the idea that diplomacy, not military might, could determine the fate of the Reich. His hope for negotiation became a shield against the unbearable reality of impending defeat, a psychological crutch that allowed him to maintain a sense of control even as his empire crumbled. The delusion was both personal and strategic. Hitler's insistence on seeking a negotiated settlement diverted attention and resources from meaningful military action. Generals and officers who might have attempted organized resistance were instead drawn into the impossible task of preparing proposals for a peace that the Allies had no intention of granting. By relying on imagined political opportunities, Hitler not only misread the enemy, but also squandered the last chances of any coherent military strategy. Even as days passed, the hope persisted. Hitler envisioned secret sympathizers within Washington or London who might influence the new president, and he allowed himself to believe that Roosevelt's death could change the trajectory of the war. This fantasy was fueled by his detachment from reality, his obsession with historical parallels, and his unwillingness to confront the consequences of years of catastrophic decision-making. In truth, the Allies' commitment to total victory was unwavering, and their strategy was informed by a clear understanding of the stakes. Hitler's hope for negotiation, like his earlier belief in political miracles, was a trap of his own making. By mid-April 1945, the contrast between Hitler's fantasy and the brutal facts of war had never been sharper. His belief in a diplomatic lifeline highlighted the depth of his denial, the intensity of his delusions, and the dangerous distance between his perception and reality. While he imagined political salvation, the Reich was collapsing under the pressure of coordinated Allied attacks, a reality that no teletype message or sudden death could undo. The war was entering its final, unavoidable phase, and Hitler's hope for negotiation would soon collide with the inexorable force of history. By mid-April 1945, the illusions that had sustained Hitler after Roosevelt's death were beginning to crumble. The reality of Germany's situation could no longer be ignored, even by a mind skilled in denial. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east, pushing through suburbs and surrounding the city with relentless pressure. From the west, American, British, and French armies were advancing deep into the heart of Germany, cutting off escape routes and capturing key industrial centers. Reports of shattered divisions, disorganized units, and retreating soldiers filled the Reich Chancellery with an urgent, unavoidable truth: Germany was on the brink of total collapse. Hitler's initial hope that Roosevelt's death might lead to a fracture among the Allies now collided with the unyielding determination of Truman and his partners. The new American president had committed himself to continuing Roosevelt's policies, insisting on unconditional surrender and the complete destruction of the Nazi war machine. Hitler could no longer imagine that political miracles would save him. The fantasy he had clung to for days was slipping through his fingers. Every report, every telegram reinforced the grim reality he had tried so hard to deny. Inside the Führer bunker, the atmosphere was tense and grim. Hitler's aides and generals, long accustomed to his erratic behavior, now faced a leader oscillating between rage and desperation. Orders were issued with increasing urgency, often disconnected from the capabilities of the remaining German forces. Units that no longer had fuel, ammunition, or leadership were expected to hold positions against overwhelming enemy forces. Hitler's detachment from reality reached its apex. He demanded feats that were impossible, convinced that sheer willpower and historical destiny could somehow overcome the strategic disaster unfolding outside. Even as the city itself became a battlefield, Hitler clung to fantasies of last-minute miracles. He imagined that some external intervention, political, military, or even divine, might still reverse Germany's fortunes. But the Allies' coordination was precise and relentless. The Soviet army, experienced in urban combat and driven by revenge for years of Nazi atrocities, pushed systematically into Berlin, while the Western Allies captured key towns and infrastructure, severing the Reich's ability to sustain itself. The contrast between Hitler's imagined control and the reality of encroaching armies was stark and unrelenting. Psychologically, this period revealed the extremes of Hitler's delusion. Reports of civilian suffering, destroyed neighborhoods, and mass casualties were filtered through his obsessive hope for a miracle. He refused to fully acknowledge the human and military cost of the war's final weeks, focusing instead on improbable scenarios that might allow him to emerge victorious or at least negotiate survival. His reliance on historical analogy, particularly Frederick the Great's narrow escape in 1762, was now entirely divorced from the nature of the conflict he faced, a total war fought by enemies who were morally committed to his destruction. As the days passed, Hitler's inner circle could see the cracks in his reasoning widening. Advisors who once entertained his suggestions now whispered warnings and voiced concerns that were increasingly ignored. Generals tried to salvage what little operational coherence remained, but their efforts were hampered by Hitler's insistence on pursuing impossible objectives. Each failed order, each isolated unit, and each lost street in Berlin chipped away at his delusions, yet he clung stubbornly to the idea that a miracle could still arrive. By late April, the inevitability of defeat became unavoidable, though Hitler's mind still resisted it. The Reich was fragmented, its cities under siege, and its remaining forces incapable of mounting organized resistance. The fantasy of political salvation, the hope that Roosevelt's death could somehow save Germany, had been thoroughly shattered. The Allies were unified, determined, and advancing inexorably. Hitler's detachment from reality, once a tool for maintaining morale, had become a trap, preventing him from recognizing the magnitude of the collapse surrounding him. In these final days, the distance between fantasy and reality could not have been greater. Hitler's psychological reliance on miracles, negotiations, and improbable interventions had failed completely. The Reich, once a formidable military power, was disintegrating, and its leader was trapped in a world of delusion even as history closed in. The confrontation with collapse was total, and there was no turning back. The war was entering its final, decisive phase, and Hitler's illusions, so central to his leadership, had become powerless against the forces he had provoked and the enemies he could no longer evade. By the final days of April 1945, the fantasy that had sustained Hitler after Roosevelt's death was gone. The Reich, once vast and seemingly invincible, was collapsing from every direction. Soviet forces were storming Berlin, street by street, while the Western Allies controlled much of Western Germany, cutting off any hope of organized resistance or retreat. The illusion that political miracles could override military reality had been destroyed, leaving Hitler isolated, desperate, and trapped within the confines of his own bunker. Hitler's advisors and generals had long recognized the impossibility of the situation, but many still followed orders out of fear, loyalty, or the faint hope that a miracle might arrive. The reality, however, was unavoidable. Germany's defeat was imminent. Units were scattered, communications were failing, and the population was exhausted and terrorized. Hitler himself was acutely aware, on some level, that the strategies he had relied on, the comparisons to Frederick the Great, and the fantasies of Allied division had all been illusions, yet he remained stubbornly attached to the idea that some unforeseen event could save him, even as every report contradicted that hope. The Allies were united in purpose, their commitment to total victory informed by both military strategy and moral resolve. The years of Nazi atrocities had forged a determination that was unwavering. Truman and his counterparts were not negotiable, not swayed by circumstance, and certainly not influenced by the death of a predecessor. The hope for political salvation that Hitler had nurtured for days after Roosevelt's passing was revealed to be nothing more than a desperate illusion. Hitler's miscalculations were both strategic and psychological. By relying on improbable political events instead of acknowledging the disintegration of his military, he had misled himself and those around him. The contrast between his fantasies and the unyielding reality of Allied advances exposed the flaws in his reasoning, the limits of his historical analogies, and the dangerous consequences of detachment from fact. Each lost street in Berlin, each collapsing division, each encroaching Allied unit underscored the stark difference between what Hitler imagined and what was actually happening. In these final moments, the lessons of history became unavoidable. Unlike Frederick the Great, whose wars allowed for negotiation and recovery, Hitler had waged a total ideological conflict that left no room for compromise. The Allies' moral and strategic commitment could not be undone by the death of one leader, nor by the hope for miracles. Hitler's reliance on political fantasy over military reality had accelerated his isolation and ensured that the final collapse would be total and irreversible. The trajectory of these last weeks highlights the dangers of delusion, overconfidence, and the refusal to confront inconvenient truths. Hitler's detachment from reality, his belief in miraculous interventions, and his misreading of enemy commitment prevented him from taking any meaningful steps that might have mitigated the destruction of Germany. His delusions, which had provided psychological comfort and a sense of control, ultimately became a trap, leaving him unable to respond effectively to the unstoppable forces surrounding him. By the end of April, it was clear that no miracle could arrive. The Reich was destroyed, Berlin was under siege, and Hitler's fantasies were powerless against the combined military and moral determination of the Allies. The story of these final weeks is a stark illustration of how delusion, even when combined with intelligence and historical knowledge, can blind a leader to reality. It is a reminder that strategic miscalculations, psychological detachment, and reliance on improbable events can accelerate collapse rather than prevent it. As history would record, Hitler's inability to distinguish fantasy from fact, to understand the true resolve of his enemies, and to grasp the consequences of his actions, shaped the final chapter of the Third Reich. The illusions that had dominated his thinking after Roosevelt's passing were gone, leaving only the unvarnished reality of defeat, destruction, and the irreversible consequences of total war. In the end, the collapse of Nazi Germany was complete, and the lessons of those final weeks serve as a chilling testament to the dangers of delusion in the face of reality.